Hey guys, it's Dr. Dost. Welcome back to my channel, Biblical Languages and Literature. Glad you're here for this series on the textual analysis of the book of Daniel. And today we're going to be covering Daniel chapter 1 and verse 2. We'll be parsing some Hebrew forms, looking maybe at a little bit of Masorah, wherever the text takes us. All right, without further ado, let's jump into the Hebrew text of Daniel. Okay, so let's read through the Hebrew text. All right, Daniel 1:2. ויתן אדוני בידו את יהויקים מלך יהודה ומקצת כלי בית האלוהים ויביאם ארץ שינה בית אלוהיו ואת הכלים הביא בית אוצר אלוהיו. All right, now let's read it a little bit slower. And I'll point to the words as we go through them. ויתן, ויתן אדוני בידו את יהויקים מלך יהודה ומקצת כלי בית האלוהים ויביאם ארץ שינה בית אלוהיו ואת הכלים הביא בית אוצר אלוהיו. And one more time fast. ויתן אדוני בידו את יהויקים מלך יהודה ומקצת כלי בית האלוהים ויביאם ארץ שינה בית אלוהיו ואת הכלים הביא בית אוצר אלוהיו. Okay, so let's start by analyzing the text word by word here. So the first word we have is vayeten, vayeten. And vayeten comes from the root nun tav nun, and it is in the kal stem, binyan kal, or some more standard nomenclature is the G stem. So depending on which resources you use, which grammars you use, you could call it the kal, that's the more traditional, or you can call it the G stem, either one. So I tend to use G stem because that's what's used in the comprehensive Aramaic lexicon, and a lot of other Semitic language grammars will use this nomenclature as well. But whatever you use, that's fine. So vayetain is a third masculine singular prefix conjugation. Okay, and I like to use the term prefix conjugation as opposed to yiktol or something like that, because it is just a more apt description of the forms in Hebrew, and it avoids a lot of connotations and assumptions about these words. So this is a prefix conjugation of nun tav nun. When we add the prefix, the nun assimilates, and that's why you have a tav. The tav has a dagesh in it, and so that's what happens to the first nun. It assimilates into the tav. And of course, vayetain, we have a dagesh in the yud because it is a vav consecutive. And so yetain would mean he will give or he gives. Vayetain means now he gave, now he gave. Now, if you want to follow along in the Leningrad Codex, you can do so here. So Daniel 1:2, I'm going to zoom in. Okay, and I'll just do this one word at a time because I realize if you don't have any experience with the manuscripts, it's a little hard to read. But you can just pause the recording if you want to, make out the word there. There's your vav, va. There's the yud. Notice how close in the manuscript that a yud is to a vav. There are times where it becomes very confusing. Like down here, you can see a yud, right, and a vav there, and there's a difference in length, but sometimes not a whole lot. But we got va, ye, you can see the dagesh there. Here's your tav with the dagesh in it, vayete, and there is your final nun with the accent mark above it, vayetain. Okay, so vayetain Adonai, vayetain Adonai. Now, I want to point out here that this word Adonai means Lord, but typically in the Hebrew Bible, we get the tetragrammaton Yud He Vav He, which actually spells out God's personal name. but it's pronounced, it's pronounced Adonai because of a Jewish tradition that dates to the 3rd century, or about the 3rd century, where Adonai, the generic word for Lord, came to be read in the place of God's actual name. I actually discuss evidence for this in my book, The Subloco Notes and the Former Prophets of Biblia Hebraica Stuttgartensia. And I don't have the page number to hand because I'm recording this in my classroom and not in my office. But there is a footnote in one of the Masoretic notes that deals with that very issue, in which I comment on the approximate date of the origin of reading Adonai, the word for Lord, in place of the name of God. And it's about the 3rd century BC based on available evidence. So we translate these together. Vayiten Adonai, now the Lord gave, verb followed by the subject, biado, into his hand. Ba means into, in this case. Yad means hand, and O is the 3rd masculine singular pronominal suffix. The 3rd masculine singular pronominal suffix, into his hand. Now the Lord gave into his hand, and now et signifies a definite direct object. Not just a direct object, but a definite direct object. For those who speak Spanish, this is somewhat akin, not exactly, but somewhat akin to the way is used for personal direct objects in Spanish. So if you are a Spanish speaker, this will make sense to you. If you don't speak Spanish well, don't worry about it. Okay? They're not identical, but they are roughly akin to one another. So, Vayeten Adonai biado et Yehoiakim. So the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand. Into his hand. Now, into whose hand? Well, we go back to verse 1 here, and we saw in verse 1, we did this in the last video, Bishnat Shlosh Malchut Yehoiakim, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Melech Yehuda, the king of Judah, Ba Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel. The Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came, right? Yerushalayim, to Jerusalem, Vayatza Alea, and he besieged it. So we're talking here, the O, the pronoun O, pronominal suffix O, I should say, refers back to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, it has an anaphoric reference. That means it refers to something that precedes, as opposed to cataphoric, which would be something that follows. Okay, so now the Lord gave into his hand, that is, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, Jehoiakim Melech Yehuda, the king of Judah. The king of Judah. Okay? And then we have Umiktsat Kilei, and literally it would be, and from, and we're going to translate Kitsat here as some. Now you can see in the lexicon, whoop, that's not the right reference. I think I must have scrolled through before here. Let's go back to the right reference. There we go. So in the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon, okay, so Ktsat has a number of translations throughout the Hebrew Bible. A lot of times it means end or extremity. But you see here, Miktsat can mean at the end of. We're going to see that in Daniel 1:5, Daniel 1:15, and so on. But it also means a part of or some of, as in Daniel 1:2 and Nehemiah 7:69. Nehemiah 7:69. In fact, why don't we just take a little detour over to Nehemiah. All right, so we need to pause for a second before we read anything more. So we can go over to the Dotan Reich Masorah thesaurus, which I regularly reference in my work on the Subloco Notes and the Former Prophets. And here we see Daniel chapter 1, verse 2. Aleph is for chapter 1. The Beit is for verse 2, Daniel 1:2. And we can see that the entry here is the word Adonai. Adonai. And so Dotan Reich put they enter the Masoretic note as it appears in the manuscript 11 times written thus in this book. And so what are those 11 times? Well, we see here that the first one is obviously Daniel 1:2. And then the second one, Daniel. Now let's see how you do with your Hebrew numbers, right? So Daniel, what does the Tate mean? But for today, that is going to have to do. All right, so if you have any questions, please leave them in the discussion, post them below, I should say. And, we'll see you next time in our next video for Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3. All right, everybody. Ciao, ciao.